My scary experience happened to me when I was traveling in Spain last year with a friend. We are both girls and would have both been 21 when this happened. We were staying in Malaga, in the south of Spain. The hostel we were staying in had 4 or 5 floors. It had a rooftop where they would have a barbecue at night, and people could drink up there. The hostel didn't have a lockout time, and there was always a staff member downstairs in the office at night. Our dorm was technically a 12-bedroom, all bunk beds, but it was set out a bit strangely. When you opened the door from the stairwell, there were 3 bunks off to the right, and to the left was the bathroom and a doorway. The doorway led to the second room with 3 bunks. So it was pretty much a separate room, but the people staying there used the same bathroom and had to leave through the main room to get out to the stairs. Hope that makes sense. My friend and I were sleeping in the bunk closest to the door in the main room. I was on the top bunk. There were 2 other guys staying in the main room. In the second room were a group of 5 guys who were traveling together. They were all quite tall guys, all over 6 feet, I'd say, and quite strong looking. I had said hello to one of them and not got much of a response, so just kinda ignored them after that. We did think they were a little bit weird though, because they would walk around in their underwear all the time. And they all wore tighty whities. One night my friend and I went up to the roof to have some drinks and meet people. There were 2 tables up there, and we sat at the one that had space. I realized when we sat down that we were sitting with the underwear guys who were traveling together. My friend was sitting next to another guy who wasn't in their group, a Dutch guy. The guy next to me says, "Hello, you are the girls from our room." They started being really friendly, which was a big contrast from other times we had seen them. They asked us where we were from, Australia, and we found out they were from Croatia. One of them called out to his friend on the other table. It was weird because he was speaking Croatian, but it was obvious that he was talking about my friend and me. We heard Australian and he was gesturing at us. Even the Dutch guy kinda raised his eyebrows at us and goes awkward. They then asked us what we were doing that night. We told them we were having a quiet one. They were planning on going out to a club and then coming back to pack for their 6 a.m. flight. They started giving us shit about not going out, saying we were weak and wasting our time in Spain. I was honestly a bit sick of them by this point. They were kinda rude, and they had a strange aggressive way of speaking. Luckily my friend was on the same wavelength. I could tell by the bitchy side eyes she was throwing in their direction. So we just stuck around, hanging with the Dutch guy, until eventually the Croatian guys left. We ended up going out to a bar and got back to the hostel around 2. I noticed that there was a men's t-shirt hung over the rail on my bunk. I took it off and chucked it on one of the empty bunks. My friend went straight to sleep, but I stayed up under covers and spoke on Skype with my boyfriend. At around 3, the Croatian boys arrived back. They stomped through the door and left it wide open, which let in all this light from the hall light. They were loud and stomped through the room talking loudly, no consideration for the other people in the room who were asleep. I had pulled the covers so it was covering my entire head and still had my computer open under the sheet, typing to my boyfriend. One of the guys kept saying, "Hey, Australian girl. Hey, you on the top bunk." I ignored all of this and pretended to be asleep. I could hear them go into their room and they started crashing around and packing. All of a sudden I felt this tap on my shoulder. I ignore it and then I get the tap again and someone trying to pull my sheet down. I'm getting pretty annoyed and yank down the sheet so I can glare at whoever is bugging me. It's one of the Croatian guys, and he absolutely reeks of alcohol. He says, "What are you doing?" I go, "I'm talking to my boyfriend." I had to repeat myself a few times before he understood. He gets this nasty look on his face and tells me that I'm keeping everyone in the room awake with the light from my computer screen. I get really angry and tell him that everyone is awake because they are being noisy and have left the door wide open. He goes back to his room, and I hear them talking. They are speaking Croatian, but I think they are talking about me as I keep hearing them say "Australian girl," followed by "bitch," and other words that aren't very nice. I've shut my computer by this point and am just trying to go to sleep when I get to pulling at my sheet again. It is the same guy and another one of his friends. He says sorry for waking me. I tell him it's fine and that I'm going to go to sleep. He keeps pulling my sheet and tapping on my shoulder, though. He then is like, "You took my shirt." I point to where I threw the shirt and he goes back to his room. I can still hear them saying awful things about me, even accusing me of stealing the guy's shirt. It was so weird because from the snatches of conversation that I could understand, it was obvious they were talking about me, but they weren't talking to me directly. I wasn't quite sure how to handle it. I was mainly worried that they were going to do something to my stuff. My bag was right near the doorway. I was sitting up and glaring at the guys whenever they walked out to go into the bathroom with the intention of deterring them from messing with my bag. Not sure what I thought this would achieve, but I do have a pretty scary evil glare. One of the other guys in my room mouthed to me, "Are you okay?" My friend and the other guy in the room were fast asleep, though. Not much help there. I was just trying to decide whether I should go down and try to get someone to call the police or something. I didn't need to, though. The guy working in the office downstairs came up. He told them to shut up and leave. They were really rude to him as well and told him to fuck off. I was actually pretty scared for myself and for him at this point. He was a fairly small guy telling off 5 big, drunk guys. He was great though. He just stood in the hall and kept telling them to get going. Eventually, they left, still swearing and yelling at me. I think it was really lucky that they did have to leave to catch a flight. I don't know what would have happened otherwise. I was mainly just angry at the time, but when I told people about it afterwards, I realized it was a really scary situation. This happened back in the spring of 2007 when my buddy and I were on a month-long backpacking trip across Europe. We had started in London and took every imaginable mode of transportation through France, the Netherlands, Germany, Austria, and finally ended our trip in Italy. Due to a bus delay, we arrived in Rome several hours later than scheduled. The folks at the hostel said they had assumed we weren't going to show and rented out our beds to other travelers. Not to worry, they told us, there was a spillover property across the city they rented out for such an occasion. This was a 2-bedroom apartment with several bunk beds packed into the rooms. Here we spent our last 3 nights in Europe along with a group of young Spaniards we ended up going out clubbing with and having a blast. On our last day, our Spanish friends left and were replaced by a large group of 10 Latin American men and 1 woman that we met briefly before heading out for our final night in Rome. There was a bit of a language barrier, but everyone seemed nice, and we headed out separately. My friend and I got back to our bunks around 2 a.m., and about an hour later, the other group shambled in. Clearly pretty drunk, they all got in their bunks, and within 15 minutes, the lights were out, and they were snoring away. All but one. One of the young men, on an upper bunk directly across from me, was still awake, seemingly playing with his phone. My eyes were shut, and I was starting to drift off to sleep just as a bright light hit me directly in the face, and I heard the shutter click sound on his camera phone. Annoyed but not wanting to be confrontational, I turned onto my back, facing slightly away, hoping he would just go to bed. Instead, he continued taking photos of me, whispering obscenities, in English, that I won't repeat here. I realized that passivity was the wrong strategy when he got down off his bunk and crept over to mine. For a few moments, he stood over me, apparently with his hands on the upper bunk, where my traveling companion slept. At this point, my heart rate went through the roof, and I quickly started considering options. A cold realization suddenly hit me. We were in a private apartment with no other travelers or staff in the building. If I confronted this person, he might awake his companions. I had no idea whether any of these men were dangerous, and if they were, we might be in for the fight of our lives. If they were so inclined, they could probably kill us and just say we had left on schedule, and we'd never be heard from again. I was thinking of kicking this dude in the stomach and bolting for the kitchen to grab a knife when he suddenly knelt down and reached into my bed. That was it. I sat up sharply and got right in his face, asking, "You fucking need something, "Dude," as menacingly as I could. He froze. Without saying a word, he got up and walked into the common area. I heard the bathroom door shut. About a minute later, he got back in his bunk, and 10 minutes after that, he too was snoring peacefully. I was wide awake, fully dressed, and ready for battle the rest of the night. Shortly before dawn, I woke my friend, and we got out of there. He did ask what was that guy doing last night, but I have no idea how aware he was of the whole thing. We were on our flight to Heathrow a couple of hours later and have never discussed it since. Let me preface this story by explaining why I was traveling alone. My best friend, Kyla, and I work seasonally at a hiking lodge in British Columbia during the summer. We're both girls in our early 20s. She lives and goes to school in New Brunswick, while I work as a chef in Toronto during the winter. This year, as I bought a car, instead of flying back home, we decided to do an epic Canadian coast-to-coast road trip. Everything was going wonderfully, and we ended up staying longer in a few unexpected places, having to cut our East Coast portion of the trip short. Now, my friend Kyla started her schooling on November 1st. So, I dropped her off at her home in Moncton, New Brunswick, on Halloween and stayed the night at her place, planning to head back to Toronto the next day. After a few glasses of Chardonnay and some laughs, I decided I couldn't come this close to the East Coast and not see the Cabot Trail in Nova Scotia, something that has been on my bucket list for years. So, knowing I still had a week more of vacation before my winter contract, I hastily booked a hostel for the next day, November 1st, at the Acolyte Hostel on the Cabot Trail. When I booked, only one option came up. I assumed because I waited until the last minute to book a private dorm with a queen-sized bed for $35. I thought, what a bargain, and booked immediately. I left Kyla's house in Moncton at 7 a.m., knowing it was a long drive. Now the Cabot Trail is roughly 150 kilometers long, so I thought to be safe, I'd plug the hostel address into my Google Maps and head straight there to get my bearings. I would arrive at the hostel for roughly noon. Knowing it was too early to check in, I figured I'd consult with the front desk and figure out the nearby hiking trails and bring my bags in later. I was about to arrive at my hostel, according to Google, but all around me was nothing but farmland. Google instructed me, the destination is on your left, but I saw nothing. About 50 yards up the road, I saw a wire bar bent to look like the letter A spray-painted bright red. I assumed that must be the Acolyte Hostel, and I followed the dirt road. It led me to what I can only describe as a dilapidated barn with no signage. There were 2 cars parked in front, so I parked alongside and got out of my car to figure out where I was. Once I got out, a smallish man around mid-40s with dark hair and intense eyes popped out of the barn and asked me if I was staying with them tonight. I said yes, and he asked why I booked so last minute. I explained my situation, and seemingly satisfied with my answer, he insisted on giving me the grand tour of the barn. The first thing I noticed was that the entirety of the barn had been dug out around its foundation, about 5 feet deep and 3 feet around. He led me across some particle board laid down as a sort of ramp leading inside. The second thing I noticed about the property was that there were no windows. This was clearly a barn meant for livestock. The gentleman leading me on this tour was named Kevin, the owner. He proceeded to tell me his grand plans for the space. It all seemed pretty far-fetched, as it was just a big old barn with particle boards separating most of the rooms. He led me up the skeleton stairs made of plywood and 2x4s to the cabin loft, where I would be sleeping that night, along with his family, the mother of his 5-year-old son, his son, and Kevin's own mother, who insisted I call her mom. The upstairs was certainly open concept. A frail curtain separated the beds to the sides with a large open area in the middle. I asked if I was his only occupant that night, and he said yes. I had a feeling he didn't often get occupants. I told him I was interested in the hikes in the area and wanted to get to them before it got dark. He gave me very detailed instructions on his favorite hikes and how to get to them, and off I went. I figured the place wasn't ideal, and I wished the website would have let me know it was still being built. But hey, I booked last minute and beggars can't be choosers. Plus, he was very friendly and helpful with my hiking advice. I hiked the area until it started getting dark. I didn't pack enough food for the day, but I figured I'd head into town for dinner. The nearest town was clearly a booming tourist destination during the summer, but now in the off-season, it was a ghost town. All the hotels and B&Bs in the area were boarded up. Such a ghost town, even the liquor store was closed for the off-season. Finally, I found a dark, dingy, empty bar to eat dinner. It was, to phrase it lightly, a disappointing supper. I had this romantic image in my head of me sitting on the harbor front, sipping on bubbly, slurping back some ocean-fresh oysters. I was assured by the server/bartender/cook that the fried oysters I had ordered were definitely not fresh. I figured with all my options for things to do and see exhausted, I should just head back to the hostel and read my book. I got back around 8 p.m., and I could smell the family was in the midst of cooking dinner. A little boy ran down the wood steps to greet me. He yelled, as little boys always do, "My name is JP, what's yours?" I said, "Nice to meet you, JP, my name is Alex." He immediately asked if I wanted to come play. I said definitely, just let me put my bags down in my room first. He followed me through the translucent curtains to my room, so instead of getting settled in, I just headed straight out into the main area. I started throwing a foam ball around with JP. His mother, father, Kevin, and grandmother were all just sitting down to eat without even acknowledging we were there, playing in front of them. The mother and father just started what seemed to be a basic argument, which then turned into them yelling at each other. Completely weirded out, I told JP I needed to go to my room and call my mommy, as she is wondering where I am. Of course, the boy who doesn't understand proper boundaries yet followed me through the curtains and sat on my bed. I tried taking his attention away from his family fighting, so I started asking him where he goes to school, his favorite color, etc. His mother started calling for him, he didn't answer, instead chose to sit in my lap and hug me. Not wanting to cause any problems, I yelled to the mother he is in my room. She runs in and snatches him off my lap and yells to the father, "I know what you're like when you get this angry, I'm taking JP, don't follow us." I hear her book it down the stairs, and him run after her. I hear a car start up in the lot, and not just drive, but freaking peel out of that driveway. I hear him cursing, a door slams, and then the sound of the excavator I had seen outside earlier that day came on. I guess he wanted to do some handiwork to let off some steam. Now just left upstairs is me and Grandma, who still insisted I call her mom. I walk out of my not-so-private curtained room with my bag and say, "Listen, you guys have been great hosts, but I should go." She starts rubbing my arm and telling me to stay. Explaining her daughter-in-law doesn't understand Kevin like she does, and she's the real problem. Now I'm ready to tell Mom to heck right off and just leave until I realize she still has a knife in her hand from cooking dinner. It's only a 4-inch paring knife, but with intent, I'm sure it would do some damage. I don't think she meant it as a threat. I think she was just a kooky old bird who didn't understand. Maybe don't hold a knife while trying to console a stranger. So I go along with what she is saying while she rubs my arm with one hand and flails the knife around in the other. I inch closer and closer downstairs and toward the door. She keeps rubbing my arm and shoulders with her free hand, telling me to stay, and that her grandson is special, and before I even booked the night, he had a premonition I would be staying with them. As soon as I get out the door, I run towards my car. I start my engine and back up in the lot to get out of there. Kevin in the excavator blocks the path, with about a 5-foot ditch on one side of the drive and a forest behind me. He gets out, says he's sorry, and tells me I should stay, he'll make it up to me. Grandma comes out with the knife still in hand, saying it's Kevin's fault I'm leaving. They bicker for 5 full minutes until I yell if they don't let me leave, I'm calling the police. All of a sudden, they get super defensive, like I'm the one being unreasonable. So I turn off my engine and start to dial. Kevin gets back in his excavator and starts backing up. As soon as he's far enough, I can see an opening to drive across the grass. I turn my engine back on and rip out of the drive, I'm sure doing a number on the suspension of my little sedan. As soon as the property is out of sight, I go to call my friend Kyla. No service. I remembered back to earlier in the afternoon when I first got to the hostel. I was going to check my messages and saw the no service sign. Even if I wanted to, I wouldn't have been able to call the cops. I drove the 6 hours straight to Moncton, New Brunswick, and stayed with Kyla.